guys, so occult tea. I don't usually hop on reaction roundup posts like this, but I thought this one was pretty interesting and generating some thoughtful conversation. I heard about this through Laura Tempest Zakroff's Patreon community, and she hosted a really juicy conversation on these questions over there, and I kept thinking about them after, so I thought, oh, why not? This would be great blog fodder, and I definitely wanted to do a video component with this one because I think tone is important. Some of the things that I have to say are a little bit spicy, but it's all meant in a spirit of love and good cheer. So let's get into it. And let's credit and thank the organizers here, Ella Harrison, the Redheaded Witch, and Polish Folk Witch for putting this together. All right, introduction. Introduce yourself. How long have you been participating in the witchcraft online space? What practices and topics do you discuss primarily? So, hi, my name is Evie Marin. I go by the nickname Evan socially. I'm the author-illustrator of the Interrobang Tarot blog, and I'm a tarot deck designer. I've been interested in witchcraft since early childhood and lurking since probably my teenage years. Been spending more time on the online community, starting in my mid-20s, just soaking up information and checking out what other people were up to. And then I started actively participating as a creator in the community and a blogger in 2015 when I launched the Interrobang Tarot project. So before that, I decided that I really wanted to limit how much and what sides of my craft I talked about in public. I didn't want to internet my entire spirituality, so I decided to focus on tarot, in part because I have an arts background and I had a lot of experience in tarot, so I felt there was a lot that I could speak to there, and in part because I wanted to design decks, so I had some key projects that I wanted to get done there. And originally, I really only thought that this was going to be like a year or two project. I thought that the blog would just be temporary while I designed a couple decks, and I'd just wrap it up and, you know, just have it be a one-off project. I was not planning to become a public witch or be blogging about occult stuff long term, and what a surprise to still be here 9 years in. The tarot decks took longer than I expected, is how that happened. The worldview behind my practice blends agnosticism and animism. I call the kind of craft that I do focus eterica, and I really like to camp out in the space between occultism, mysticism, and the fine arts. What is my personal reasoning, inspiration behind sharing my practice online? What am I looking to achieve by participating? Do I seek to educate, learn, or connect? Bit of all three for sure. Leading up to starting the tarot blog, I was recovering from a long round of illness, and I was really seeking to keep in touch with the community and to find more people of common interests and values, which I've struggled to find in a lot of the places that I've been living. So there was definitely a component of wanting to connect to people and find community. I'm also a huge nerd for this stuff and love to learn as much as I love to share. So I really was looking for all three: connection with other practitioners, to learn more and deepen my craft, and then to share the process and thinking behind the projects that I was working on in tarot. So how do I believe social media as a whole has impacted the community? How do I think social platforms such as TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube have each impacted education and sharing information? Total mixed bag. It's definitely a double-edged sword. Speaking as somebody with chronic illnesses, I know a lot of the ill and disabled community. We find each other online. So it's a lifeline in some respects, and a lot of what I do as an artist is only possible because of online communities, and social media is certainly a part of that. I've received a lot from social media that I won't deny. At the same time, I am concerned about social media's impact on society, and the way that this affects the occult community is not separable from the way that it impacts society as a whole. So these platforms are designed to be addictive. We know that. They harness and farm attention at all costs, and because of that, they tend to boost a lot of negative emotions, misinformation, disinformation, sensationalized content, and that's certainly taken a toll on society, culture, attention spans, and democracy. So those are real concerns, and part of me thinks that the social media platforms might be a net negative, and at the same time I can also recognize that they're really necessary and vital to people, and a lot of us are relying on them for work and social connections, so it's very mixed. I don't always love social media, but I also don't support banning it. I think there are other ways to set limits on it, and there are other ways to connect online besides social media. I've actually gotten more on the whole out of YouTube than a lot of the other platforms, so I'm not as irritated at YouTube as I am with like the meta platforms say. There's a lot of really good educational stuff on YouTube that's so much easier to access, especially as I'm a musician, so it's so easy to go on and look up techniques and different things that in other times you would have to go to all these different teachers for. So it really has radically changed educational sharing in niche interests and hobbies, and it's amazing what you can access for little to no money on YouTube in terms of artistic instruction right now. That really blows my mind, and it's something that I really appreciate. I would really recommend Jaron Lanier's work to anybody trying to figure out a better balance for you with social media. He's not an occultist. He's a Silicon Valley insider turned whistleblower, and he writes about the ways that social media apps are designed to harness and farm our attention and what they do to us psychologically. He's got a book. It's called something like 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts, which is a little bit of a sensationalized title, right? But he does talk about how it's okay to stay on social media and just figure out like what balance you need for you, and that should be a choice driven by you and tailored to your own values and your needs. So I got a lot out of his book. I did end up actually leaving Facebook completely, and that was a great decision for me. I've cut way back on Instagram and really adjusted my expectations of what I'm going to get out of that app and what I'm on there for. And sometimes I do take long breaks in social media fasts. So I'm not a huge social media person. I'm more interested in other ways to connect online personally. But I recognize that the apps are necessary to a lot of people, and I don't judge that. I also want to acknowledge that the field is full of mellow people who are in it for the right reasons and doing really cool work, and those aren't always the loudest voices online or in any sphere, but you can find those people, and the balance can shift to the positive when you curate your feeds carefully. And that's possible online in a way that might not have been possible in the past in a local scene if your only access to the occult community was in your local community and your local scene sucked. Like, you'd just be fucked. So there is a lot more potential to find the people that you are looking for online when you're limited geographically in what you can access. Is consuming witchcraft content becoming a substitute for practice? Nah. I really don't worry about that. I think part of it is probably age-based because I'm in my mid-30s, so I've been hearing people bitch about armchair occultists for decades. And I really do think that the armchair occultist is a straw man and maybe a little bit of a projection of our own inner input to output meters when that rears up for us. It can totally be worth asking yourself that question. Have I tipped my balance too far towards study as opposed to praxis? And sometimes that answer is going to be yes, but it doesn't mean that it's replacing practice for you on the whole. It just means your balance has gotten a little bit off, and maybe it's time to get back to crafting or back to the drawing board. So it's not a big deal. It's just information. It's just a little internal compass. People have a right to engage with this material intellectually, academically, and aesthetically and artistically as they want to, and if that's all they want to do, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with being a researcher in the field. There's nothing wrong with being an artist in the field and choosing not to practice in ways that other people do. And if somebody does that, that's not really a threat to anybody else's practice. So I just don't think it's a big deal at all. And also, the input and research side is really enriching, and it's a part of the overall balance in your practice. It's really important in a creative practice and as an artist, and I think that this does carry over into things like witchcraft, occultism, magical practice. To have fallow seasons, to have seasons and periods where you're not doing as much and you're in more of an input mode than an output or practice or craft or creation mode. We can't force ourselves into output mode all the time, and it can be really restorative and balancing and helpful to spend some seasons on research, or to spend some seasons just chilling out and recharging our batteries. And that's part of the picture. It's cyclical, it's seasonal, and it tends to course correct itself. But if it's something that's bugging you internally, it probably just means that that's your own meter or your gauge ringing bells for you, and that it's time to get back to practice now. That's fine. It's not something to worry about what anybody else is doing. All right, topic 2, influencer authenticity. Out of what I share on social media, how much of it is staged versus reality? I love this question entirely for spicy reasons, because I'm going to push back on it. So why is staged not reality, right? Snark aside, I totally get why people wouldn't want to share their most private rituals and spells in public, and would choose to do demo and sample spells and altars, and that's completely reasonable. I do a little bit of that, but since I don't really demo spells so much, my focus is more on tarot. Those lines are necessarily much blurrier. If I'm doing a demonstration tarot reading, it's not going to be the same as a private reading for me, but it's still the way that I read tarot. It's still a real reading for the group. If I'm putting together a nice aesthetic picture for a social media channel or for one of my websites, yes, I'm arranging things nicely, but that's also part of what I do in my crafts as an artist and fussy aesthetic person the rest of my life. The way that I dress is the way that I dress for me. The way that my space is set up is the way that my space is set up for me. And at the same time, my aesthetics are also informed by a literal background in stage design and technical theater. So those lines are very blurry for me personally as an artist. But also, I think that a lot of magic and spellcraft and ritual has a very staged and aesthetic and sensual component, even behind the scenes, even when it's private. There are aspects that we write in advance, that we script out, that we arrange just so. A lot of it's prepared, and a lot of it is, it has a kind of theatrical or artistic flair to it. So I don't think occultists have any leg to stand on in judging other people for being too aesthetic, because we all engage in aesthetics and beauty to different degrees. We might have different standards of these things. I'm not a big fan of mainstream beauty standards, but in terms of engaging in beauty and aesthetic and sensuality and theater and staging, I think we all do that to different degrees, even in our private practices, and that's just part of it. I'm not a natural blue. Early graying runs in my family. My hair started going gray when I was a teenager. So yeah, there's usually some component that is staged, and there's also a component in everything that's real, and those things can occupy the same space very easily. Glamor is an entire branch of the craft. It's a very vibrant side of the craft, and I tend to think when I see really curated social media feeds in occultism, I read that as seeing part of how somebody glamours. It's also fun to note that when you're seeing demo spells online, there can still be active ritual or magical components to that may or may not have anything to do with what the caption and the title and the theme of the spell is about. These things can be very layered. Do I think there is an element of censorship in online spaces? Absolutely. There's a lot of censorship in online spaces, and it's not opinion, it's just fact. You can find numerous studies and countless anecdotal evidence of censoring in the different social media apps and landscapes. So it's widely known and understood that BIPOC and LGBTQ creators get disproportionately suppressed in a lot of the algorithms. TikTok got caught expressly telling their moderators to suppress content by, quote, poor and ugly people, which is terrible. You can get shadow banned for talking about your politics. A lot of algorithms tend to disproportionately boost conservative propaganda and suppress progressive and anti-racist activism, which is super fucked up. And then artists are getting shadow banned and cracked down on, especially if anything that they do involves bodies and could potentially be sexualized. Queer content creators get shadow banned and suppressed for being too sexual, whether or not we actually view what we're posting as sexualized ourselves. Just our identities get hypersexualized by outside viewers, and if that can be deemed as offensive to a conservative audience, it can get suppressed, or just funneled into a little bubble where only other queer people are seeing your stuff. So yeah, this happens a lot. Also, like artists and small businesses, you can't talk openly about finished projects or external links or subscription platforms or anything like that. If the algorithms pick up on external links or mentions of platforms like Patreon, Kickstarter, your own website, things like that, you'll get suppressed in the algorithm unless you pay to play. So there's a lot of censorship going on. It's very aggravating and disheartening. It's gotten really bad on Instagram since Meta acquired the platform, and it keeps getting worse every year. And I think it's very dangerous to treat social media as though it's an even playing field, because it's not. It's probably enforcing biases that you may or may not be aware of. The algorithms encode the biases of the people that program them, and if you also share those biases, you might not notice how filtered and bubbly your feeds are, unless you're actively seeking that information out. And I've just seen so many really amazing creatives and artists, people who are very hardworking, very consistent, and producing excellent, top-notch work, just talk about losing their followings and losing their engagement and different algorithm shifts and things. So yeah, it's definitely not a creator-friendly landscape, and it's very volatile. Any following that you build on social media, you can lose overnight in an algorithm shift or the change of law. These platforms come and go a lot faster than a human lifetime or a career does. So you want to be careful with how much of your craft and artistry eggs you're putting into anyone's social media platform basket. And again, the social media apps are not the only or best way necessarily to connect online. So make sure that you're feeding and building your own platforms off of social media, your own website, your newsletter, your Discord communities, things like that. How do I decipher what is appropriate to share online versus what to keep privately? Is this based on social media etiquette? For me, a lot of it is based on old-fashioned work etiquette, which maybe sounds a little bit ironic for how much of my content is based around swear words. But when I'm online, if my feeds are public, and sometimes I do set them private and just kind of retreat from the whole social media landscape. But if my feeds are public, whatever part of my platform is public, that's me showing up as an artist, and I'm at work when I'm doing that. So some part of my life, there's a part of the house that's always a mess. There's a part of my day that I spend on the couch in sweatpants eating tater tots and watching Our Flag Means Death, but I don't really want to hang out in my jammies with the entire internet. So you dress kind of put together for work, you clean up your space for company, it's that sort of thing. And it has more to do with manners and artistry for me than, trying to pretend that those other aspects of my life don't exist. It's not about deception or misleading people. It's just, we all curate, and you would curate yourself for any other job, so why would it be different for artists and creatives and freelancers? In terms of what of my craft am I going to share online, that comes down to things that I can speak to well, things that I know well enough to teach other people responsibly, things that translate to an outside audience. I would hold back on anything that's too private or ephemeral or hard to put into words. There are aspects to my craft and spirituality that just feel very beautiful and personal to me and delicate in a way that I don't want to subject them to outside gaze or to the whole internet. Gaze as in Gaze, not Gays's. All of my craft can be subject to the gaze, but not the gaze with a Y, not the gaze with a Z. I factor in things like privacy for other people, for clients, friends, family, allies. I'm not going to share stories that aren't mine to tell necessarily. And then I also think about what is going to make sense and be okay to share if it's spread out of context. So you have to assume that whatever you put online, it might be taken and circulated far away from your own platform. So I noticed that happening with a lot of my tarot spreads, that they were circulating far away from my own platform, sometimes without attribution, or even other people claiming credit for them, which is fucked up. But fortunately, that's not, the majority. But anything that you share online could be circulated out of context. And a lot of people were interacting with my spreads as like memes and jokes and things. And that's okay. Like, I understand that. I'm not mad about that for the stuff that it's already happened with. But when I wanted to go deeper and weirder with my spread craft, I ended up paywalling most of it. And a big part of that is just to make sure that the people that are seeing it get the notes and the rundown and the context that make the spreads more effective for them to use and more responsible for me to share as an artist. So that's something to think about too. Oh, and I kept the paywall mad cheap. It starts at $1 a month, so it's very accessible, but it's just a little layer of protection. Have I ever encountered or heard of grifters in our community? Do I recognize them? What are significant signs of grifters in the community? Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely grifters in the community. There are grifters in every sphere online right now. A lot of it actually comes from outside the community. A lot of it is organized cybercrime. So most of it is easy to spot once you know the red flags. So one of the biggest scams running at the moment is the Copycat Scams, where organized cybercriminals will closely copy the platforms and feeds of known occult authors and popular bloggers and influencers, and they'll steal their pictures, they'll steal their photos, their names. They'll do a handle that's really close to the original name with just like 1 or 2 misspellings in it or an extra number or something like that. And then they'll DM people claiming to be offering readings or a message from your ancestors or something like that, but they're really fishing for credit card information. So those are pretty easy to spot. One thing to look for, glaring error, is misspellings in the name. If you see a feed with a lot of posts coming from the same day or through the same week, it probably means that they screenshot somebody else's feed and then uploaded those posts one after another. On Instagram, you can go to their profile and you can click the little ... icon up at the top of the screen, and that will show you how many times an account has changed their name and where they're based. So red flags to look for there would be a lot of name changes on the account and a location based in a different country than the person that they're claiming to be. But the biggest red flag is just being sketchy in people's DMs. No legitimate practitioner is ever going to DM you soliciting a reading or asking you for money. That's not a thing that honest people do. So if somebody is being sketchy in your DMs, they're probably a scammer. And another way to check on these things is if somebody from the community follows you online, somebody who looks like an author or somebody with a really large following, go ahead and just like search their name and see if something else comes up that's very similar, and see who's been posting the longest and who has the most authentic looking feed with a longer timeline and posts spaced out and better behavior. So you can identify those things pretty easily that way. Another big scam in the community that's been going on for centuries is the curse breaking scam, where somebody will tell you that you're cursed and then offer to lift the curse for you or do an exorcism or a clearing or something like that for some exorbitant fee, or they'll offer to do a multi-series candle spell for you with, absolutely no evidence of it working. But they tell you you're cursed, or one person lays a curse on you and then the next person goes and claims to lift it. So yeah, that one is old as time. If somebody tells you that you're cursed out of the blue, they're either being a dick or they're trying to manipulate you. It's a big red flag. So watch out for that. And then one of the other big grifts would be bootlegged and AI books, fake books. and like bootlegged tools and things like that. So when you're buying tools or decks or artwork, you want to make sure that you're getting that from the real artist's official website or through a legitimate stockist with good reviews. And with books, you want to check and make sure that the author has an actual profile. If they're using a stock image as their bio photo, they're probably doing AI or bootlegs. If they're churning out content on a ridiculous, unbelievable timeline, it's probably fake. 2 books in a year would be prolific for a human author. 2 books in a month, that's AI or plagiarism. And those are really important to watch out for because some of them do contain dangerous misinformation on, things like working with hazardous materials and stuff. You don't want to dick around with AI generated occult books because that can get really gnarly. It's a double-edged sword and not always great that you need a platform to be an author or a creator online these days. But a lot of people know that and it's widely understood. So most of the legitimate authors in the field, they're going to be showing up, doing talks on blogs or YouTube channels, classes in person at events. They'll be on podcasts in the podcast network. They'll be somewhere else. You'll be able to find traces of them online, engaging and being accountable to other people in the community if they're a real author. So those are all things to watch out for there. I would also recommend John Oliver's recent segment on the pig butchering scam. That's not in the occult community specifically, but it is a really big online scam right now that's really good to know about and have on your radar. And also the perspective from his show is relevant to the occult community, just that a lot of the low-level people on the other side of these scams, the people that are doing the grunt work for them, are coming from human trafficking, or they're in abusive dynamics where maybe it is a choice, but it's not a good they don't have access to good choices to be in this situation where they're stuck scamming people online. So just a little bit of perspective and compassion there, I think, is important when you are dealing with scammers and grifters in the field. Now, I also would not classify people who are just incompetent necessarily as grifters. So sometimes we throw that word around very loosely, and I would distinguish between people who are running scams with the intent to rip off and steal people's credit card information. That's a separate class to me than people who are sincere practitioners who are actually part of the community and just aren't very good at their jobs or have jumped into business before they were ready to yet and maybe haven't done all of their homework and they're hitting the ground running. Or people who just aren't a good match for you. Maybe people who work in a completely different style or they're speaking to a different level than whatever you're at now. Just because somebody's doing a kind of crappy job at their job doesn't mean that they're ripping people off. If they're being honest about what they're representing and you just don't like it, like, oh well, that's not a problem. So I would tend to lend some grace there. We really can't separate that phenomenon of people hanging their shingle too early from what's going on in the broader economy. You've got 2 generations of people trapped in the gig economy, and people don't just monetize their hobbies for shits and giggles, right? Like a lot of us, the only way that we can keep a hobby alive is to monetize some part of it. A lot of us end up in situations where we're forced into entrepreneurship because we don't have access to other jobs. And then you're stuck thinking like, crap, what can I do with my interests that does more good in the world than harm? And so there are people that are gravitating towards creating spiritual businesses, I think, for very genuine and authentic reasons, and they're just not there yet in their craft, but their heart's in the right place, and I would be inclined to lend some grace with those people, let them have their learning curves, and just take responsibility for shopping carefully on your end. So some of it ends up winding up in stepping on people's toes or ripping off people's content or spreading misinformation, and that's not great. Like, I'm not condoning that, but it comes from complex factors when that happens, and there is a place for patience and just forgiveness with that stuff, I think. But do shop carefully for yourself, for sure. There's a lot of content out there that is not necessarily high quality. Last part of this that would really take its own whole thing to address, but is important to have on your radar, and maybe I'll point you to some other resources here. I think some of what we call grifting in the community is more accurately described as cult formation, high control groups, and toxic gurus. So there is a lot of that, and that does come from within the community. So that's a function of all religion, all spirituality, wherever you have, not even just religion and spirituality, also in academia and medicine, anywhere that you have positions of hierarchy, positions with a lot of clout to them, and positions where people are placed over others in a high-powered or teaching position. That's going to breed power abuses, and it's going to attract a disproportionate number of abusers and Machiavellian and narcissistic types of personalities. So we see that in every field and every religion and spirituality. It definitely happens in the occult community, and is something important to watch out for. Learning the red flags for cults and high control groups can help a lot in avoiding toxic gurus, micro gurus, and bad actors and abusers in the field. So broadly speaking, those groups tend to use patterns of love bombing, high charisma, glamour, and grandiosity to lure people in. There'll be an erosion of boundaries and really intense love and acceptance coming up front. Speaking about changing the world and really exciting, grandiose things that you want to be a part of. And then they'll start to do a bait and switch thing where there is a slow escalation of controlling factors. So it will start with, oh, come here, you're loved and you're completely accepted. And then it will be, oh, nobody else loves and accepts you the way that we do. A lot of these groups tend to target really lonely and vulnerable people who are struggling with traumas and difficult times in their lives, people who are going through shit, and then people who are really seeking and desperate for love and affection. So yeah, once they kind of reel you in, there will be gradually escalating patterns of control and surveillance, people keeping tabs on each other, trying to make sure that you're being dragged back to regular meetings. Things just slowly escalate, and then they'll really try to isolate you and get you to cut ties with other people, not look at anybody else's resources and information, a refusal to cite sources, or all of the sources that they cite come from within the group. That's a huge red flag. And then trying to get you to cut ties with other friends and family, and ultimatums like, you know, you can only socialize with people who are in the group. That's a huge red flag. And if you're at that point, you are way further in than you want to be, and you got to get out now. Even if you have to seek outside help and fall back on relationships where things are rocky because of your involvement in this group, if it's embarrassing, if you need to seek the help of professional cult extractors, or if you need to fall back, move back in with your parents, even just whatever it takes to get away from these groups. When you get to that point where they're trying to isolate you and getting you to break ties with other friends and family, that's when they get you dependent on the group. And once you're dependent and you can't get away, the abuse rapidly escalates and gets as bad as human abuses can get in some cases. So that's a really brief summary of complex patterns. It gets much more intricate than this. There are tons of red flags that you can watch out for. We don't have time to cover that all in this video, but I'll see if I can look up some articles and get you some links there of just things to watch out for. It can be helpful even to watch documentaries about other cults, ones that have, you know, good ratings and fairly positive critical reviews. If they have good information on a particular cult that's formed, a lot of these patterns repeat from group to group, so it can get you a real good sense of how those red flags operate in practice, to go watch and listen to other people's stories who've been in high control groups. It's not fun. That stuff can be really brutal and difficult to watch, but it's great and really important to have on your radar for sure. How does a large following impact the perception of the creator? Does this immediately make them an expert, or are there other assumptions as to why they may have a large following? So yeah, no, I don't read into follower count at all. There are so many reasons that people can blow up and amass large followings, and it really doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the quality of their content in either direction. Some people with large followings have great content, but some people buy bot followers, or they pay to play, or they go viral from posting stuff that isn't even theirs. So it's really mixed. I actually tend to gravitate a little bit more towards people who tend to spend more time on long projects and their own platforms as opposed to the social media apps. So a lot of my favorites in the field really have fairly modest or sleepy followings on the social media apps, but they have great content and they're busier elsewhere. Social media success has a lot more to do with virality than integrity, and it doesn't mean that what goes viral doesn't have substance. Again, large followings can accompany really good content, so it's not something that I would use to discount anybody, but it's just also not something that I would tend to prioritize or overvalue. Another facet is that there are a lot of people in the field that don't want large followings. You'll find really amazing creatives out there and good teachers who don't want huge platforms, who don't want to do the guru thing, who tend to be a little bit more shy or reclusive. There are people that are contributing in the field that take pains to keep their social media followings smaller than they could be. So that's something to keep in mind too. And again, I tend to gravitate a little bit more towards that personality type. But it doesn't mean that people with larger followings can't also have good substance and good content too. How does one maintain the balance of authenticity and content creation? It is a never-ending process, and it's messy, and I'm still working on it myself. For me, I've really had to draw back from social media. I realized that I do some of my worst work when I play to the algorithm, and that I need breaks, I need fallow periods, and I need to work in multiple media in ways that aren't necessarily easy to categorize. So I really don't get along with the algorithms, and I've really cut back a lot on social media and spent more time in smaller pockets of the internet with paywalls and things like that in order to workshop and get my voice more authentic and more aligned with my own likes and values. I found that I couldn't figure out how to do that in front of the entire internet. I needed a more secluded space to do that. Yeah, it's an ongoing thing, and it can take you in a different direction if you really are prioritizing authenticity and artistry. It can pull you in directions that aren't necessarily going to be the best for if you're trying to build a business or build a following. That said, there are creatives who excel at short-form serial content where authenticity for them and speaking in their own voice aligns great with the social media platform formulas and algorithms and things. Content doesn't have to be really lengthy or flowery to be deep and clear and true. So there's great stuff on social media that I really enjoy as a follower and as a fan that I think works really well on those formats and is still authentic to that creator. And I'm just not, I'm not that type of creator myself, but I'm not knocking it. It's totally possible to approach the social media formats in ways that are really juicy and deep and meaningful. Topic 3, Imposter Syndrome and FOMO. When I follow other creators in the community space, does it make me feel genuinely inspired and empowered, or does it create feelings of FOMO and being less than? I would say overall it's definitely inspired. I've really received a lot from following other creatives online. I love seeing what other people get up to, and I think it's really fun. Part of that comes down to curation and just making sure that my feed is full of people that I like their content and respect what they're doing and find their information to be good, and I tend to unfollow people who kick up a lot of drama or who are posting things that I find to be half-baked or just not for me. So once your feed is curated, I find it a net positive. FOMO ironically keeps me a little bit more engaged in the community. I do struggle with burnout periodically for social media reasons and for other reasons, and I always keep coming back to it because we live in such a wonderful Candyland renaissance for occult arts and media. The access to the books and just level of quality that we have in our art and writing right now is amazing. And so part of me recognizes that my future self would be screaming regret at me if I didn't jump into these waters, being alive during an occult renaissance like this and having access to indie and democratized tech. So I keep coming back to it because of FOMO. I keep having you know, every time I burn out in the occult landscape online, which does happen for me periodically, I do get frustrated with stuff. And then FOMO reels me back in, that sense of like, oh fuck, there's bucket list stuff that I want to get done here. I got to get back in the game. So it's actually been more motivating than not, and more inspiring than not, to have other practitioners that are making just beautiful things. When I see something that I really like in somebody else's art and craft, that inspires me to join the conversation, and that inspires me to keep developing my own craft, and I really appreciate that. So I think some of what we're calling FOMO in this conversation might be better described as jealousy, and that's a little bit spicy, but bear with me. I say it with love. So nobody wants to feel like they're a jealous person, and the word jealousy is a little bit more stigmatized than the word FOMO, but I think it fits the bill here. And it's something that I'm a little bit more prone to on the creative side of things, like in artistry. I feel it most often in terms of art and music and whatever I'm working on in my projects. I'll, you know, be online and I'll see something beautiful and I'll think, oh fuck, why can't I paint like that? Or why didn't I think of that, right? And of course, sometimes this comes up in craft and spirituality too, naturally. It can come up in any sphere. But through my art practice, I got into a different relationship with that emotion and ended up really making friends with it in ways that I didn't quite expect to, when I started taking it as information about my core values and my future capabilities. So what if the feeling of jealousy is telling you something about something you could actually have or become or do? Maybe not yet, maybe not in exactly the way as whatever prompts that feeling for you. You know, we can't like become the, you know, every single person that we admire. We can't have every nice thing that we see on the internet, of course not. But when we have that feeling of jealousy or FOMO or whatever you want to call it here, it really changes our relationship to it when we start thinking about it as highlighting qualities that we could have, be, become, or do in time. So it gets a lot more fun when it's something that you can shop that way, right? It becomes a lot more motivating. It can actually transform our crafts and our lives in really powerful and meaningful ways. I noticed that when that feeling came up for me in art, it was almost always highlighting core values and tastes and areas where my own work wasn't living up and matching my values and tastes yet. It was highlighting areas where I had unmet needs or things that I just really wasn't doing the way that I wanted to be doing them. And in that event, it was throwing me a lifeline, and it was shouting about what's important, what direction to go. And when I listened to it and followed it and took it as information, it just vastly improved my capabilities. And it's been a very helpful guide in that in that way. That doesn't mean that it always feels good. It usually feels a little bit crummy when it onsets. And then when you take the note and you go, oh, okay, no, this is telling me something that I need to have on my radar, and then also it's telling me something that I can do or have, then it gets more fun. So starting to work with FOMO and jealousy in those more creative ways can really make us better artists and better crafters. It can also make us better fans in the long run. I hit a point where one night I was listening to this song that I really love on repeat, and I just got hit by this like tidal wave of gratitude where I realized I was so thankful that I hadn't written that song, that it wasn't one of mine. And it just like hit me like a ton of bricks, just like, oh my God, I'm so glad I didn't think of this. I'm so glad I didn't get to it first. I'm so glad that's not my lyric and it's somebody else's, because I can have it and I can receive it in a way that I never would be able to appreciate, that wouldn't reach me the same way that it does as a listener if it had been one of my own. And that was a little bit of a light bulb moment for me, and then that started to transfer over to other fields too. Just that sense of, oh man, I'm really glad this other person's out there doing their thing. That's really cool. It's not for me. It's actually not what I want to even do in my own lifestyle and my craft, but what an amazing gift that I can learn from their experience and take away some of the gnosis that they're sharing here without having to go through what they went through to get that. If I experience FOMO, has it ever left me feeling vulnerable to being taken advantage of financially or otherwise? An example would be the need to purchase the latest popular product or book to fit in. Now, this one hasn't been a big issue for me. I'm pretty careful about my finances and picky about what I do spend money on. I'm really happy with my thrift game and my DIY skills. So every once in a while, I'll buy a book or a tool that I end up not liking and not using a lot, and that's just how it goes. That's life. You pass it on and you let it go. But I'm careful enough and check things out well enough before I decide to make investments that I end up being really happy with what I do save up for and spend money on most of the time. And there's so many great free resources out there. There's so many ways to be thrifty and crafty with what you've got to work with. There's really no need to break the bank to keep up with the Addams family. So I think a lot of this comes down to just personal responsibility and careful shopping. And I want to push back on the notion that it's somehow financial abuse just for people to offer their goods and services in the marketplace. I mean, there's always going to be beautiful things out there that I wish I could afford and that I can't. There's always going to be amazing sounding occult books that I would love to read and they're out of my budget and it doesn't work for me. So that's how it goes, and that's how it is for everybody with anything. We're always going to see shiny things that we would like and can't have, and oh well. People have a right to offer what they have to offer and to get paid for their good work. And a lot of occult books and crafts and tools in particular are priced more expensively because they take a long time to develop and they sell small quantities. So there's actually a lot of pressure for occultists to undercharge for what we offer when we're teaching or offering creations online, and it's hard. A lot of occult authors and tarot deck designers and creatives and artisans in this field don't make anywhere near minimum wage off the labor that goes into their stuff. So I would love to see a little bit more understanding and tolerance for what people charge and what people do to survive capitalism, because remember that your favorite occult authors are also trying to survive the same economy that you are. So yeah, I don't have a problem with this one. All right. When practicing my craft, do I find myself comparing what I do to what I've been seeing people do online? Sure. I mean, I think that's so human and innate and hardwired into us to compare ourselves to whatever the group is doing, that our bodies and brains do that automatically whether or not we agree with the impulse. So I don't think that's just an internet thing. We compare ourselves to other people in pretty much everything that we do, and we contrast ourselves as well. And it's not always toxic. Sometimes it's just interesting. Sometimes it's just information. Sometimes it's inspiring. So I found a bit of advice from the Creative Pep Talk podcast. Andy J. Pizza on Creative Pep Talk says this, and I found it super helpful for dealing with social media. Don't compare your bloopers reel to somebody else's highlights reel. So a lot of times when we end up with really crummy feeling comparisons, that's what we're doing, and we're forgetting that everybody belly flops occasionally behind the scenes. We're all presenting curated sides of ourselves when we're showing up at work or when we're showing up at social media. So yeah, don't compare your most vulnerable or cringy moments to somebody else's best moments and, you know, cherry-picked portfolio pieces. So that little reminder has been very helpful for me. And then also, if I find myself comparing myself too much to other people in a way that doesn't feel good, the antidote to that for me is just to run through all the stuff that I am doing in my craft practice. And usually I'll find then that I just needed that reminder of like, oh yeah, I'm already super busy. My plate's already full and my plate is full with things that I want on my plate. So like, I'm doing fine. A lot of times those things that I find inspiring or engaging or shiny on other people's feeds aren't even things that I want to do myself. And I just need to remind myself of that. Like, okay, but I'm not doing that for reasons. It doesn't actually work with my lifestyle, or it's not actually one of my interests, but it's really cool that they're doing that and I like seeing it, and that doesn't mean that I have to do it myself. Just having a little check-in with yourself on what you actually are doing and reminding yourself of everything that you have on your own plate can really help there. In what ways do I combat imposter syndrome? It helps to identify where it's coming from. So imposter syndrome can be a few different things that come from a few different places and require different remedies depending on what prompts it. So sometimes we feel imposter syndrome because we're in toxic situations where everything that we're doing well is being discounted or hyper-criticized. And what we really need there is access to a more supportive community and an exit strategy. Sometimes imposter syndrome comes from navigating systems of oppression that are designed to exclude us, and we're walking through spaces where we're not welcome and we're not supposed to be there, and we're taking up space there anyway, and we need to revel in our imposter syndrome, or not syndrome, but revel in our imposterness and make a game of it, and we might need access to community supports there to muster up the defiance that it takes to stay in those spaces and to help with the burnout. Sometimes we feel imposter syndrome because we've gotten in over our heads and we're speaking to things that we don't actually have the expertise to discuss, and part of us is cringing for reasons. So it's not necessarily imposter syndrome if you're actually being an imposter and you need to step back and do less talking and more listening, or check yourself with a little bit of humility. That can happen. And then we also feel imposter syndrome sometimes when we've progressed to a point where we just realized everything that we don't know yet, and we get overwhelmed by how much there is to explore and to take in that we haven't gotten to yet, and we're forgetting and discounting what we've already done and what we're capable of, and we just need to review our accomplishments and build a little bit of confidence again before we get back into research and input mode. So I would recommend Dr. Devin Price's books Laziness Does Not Exist and Unlearning Shame, about systemic shame. And Laziness Does Not Exist is about the cult of hyperproductivity and capitalist, internalized capitalist programming. And those can both have some really helpful tidbits in them for people struggling with imposter syndrome, so you might like to check those out. What would my practice look like without the social media influence of other creators? This one's really hard to say for me. There's a lot that I've gotten out of social media. I think it's made me more empathetic and aware and understanding of other people's perspectives and viewpoints. I've gotten a lot of really cool artists on my radar from that, so I've taken a lot of inspiration from social media in some directions. But in terms of what I actually do in my craft practice, a lot of that derives from dream work, personal gnosis, artistic practices, and history nerdery. So I think a fair amount of what I actually do might shake out about the same or variations on the same stuff, whichever way I headed toward it. I don't get a lot of craft practices and techniques from social media apps necessarily. I tend to get more stuff that I incorporate into my practice from books and podcasts. At the same time, social media has been helpful to connecting to some of those resources. I'll even find that sometimes I'm ruminating on a question and chewing on something in mind, and before even searching for it or saying anything about it out loud, I'll find something that speaks directly to that popping up in my social media feed the next day or the next time that I open the app. So it's been an interesting and helpful connector for sync and for connecting to resources that I did find helpful in deeper ways. But again, a lot of those ended up being off social media, and I might have found them anyway through other means. But it's a very rapid connector to information and synchronicity, so that's interesting. And not all of that is mystical or paranormal, right? Like some of it's just cookies. If you Google search something and then it pops up on Instagram, like that's cookies. That's not your app being psychic. That's your app tracking all your information on your other platforms and what you're talking about in your conversations. So, but it connects us to information that we're looking for really fast. So there's something to be said for that. It's creepy sometimes. But yeah, I think I would probably still be doing variations on what I do now anyway, whether without the Witchstagram influence. I was doing variations on this stuff long before the apps, and probably will be long after they're gone. We'll bury them all. Alright. Oh, topic 4, capitalizing off community. Do I consider online communities as equally valid to in-person communities? Absolutely, and I'm really encouraged to see a lot of other people saying this too. So they're different. In-person and online communities obviously feel different, and they connect us in different ways, but I think they're both absolutely equally valid, and that's a huge accessibility issue, especially for ill, disabled, and neurodivergent people. So I do appreciate aspects of both. I've enjoyed in-person events and I've enjoyed online events. Sometimes, occasionally, I even get more out of the online stuff, in part because it allows me to pace myself and recover between things in ways that are much more challenging to do in person. Still worthwhile when I do want to do in-person gigs and events, but the online spaces can be a lot more forgiving and gentler as somebody who has neurospicy tendencies and health stuff that gets logistically a lot harder to navigate when I'm traveling and doing stuff live. If you're really highly sensitive or neurodivergent, sometimes the online stuff really can be better because there aren't those extra layers of social overwhelm and distraction that you get in person. How have online occult witchcraft communities impacted me as a person and a practitioner? It's been super mixed. And I would say like very broadly, and there are exceptions to all of what I'm about to say for me, but very broadly speaking, as a fan and as a consumer and as a reader and a student and a seeker, it's been very positive and inspiring and connective for me. And as a creative, social media in particular has been a source of major burnout and discouragement. And it's actually been a little bit depressing. But other sides of the online community have been wonderful. As an artist and a creative too, it's enabled me to work in ways that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. So it's just very mixed. But I'm not a huge fan of the biggest social apps. They've been more draining than not as a creator, but still inspiring as a seeker. So what are some of the dangers of the current phenomenon of capitalizing off the witchcraft community? So it's not just current, that's it's nothing new. And as far as individual creatives and indie people and authors offering their own stuff, I'm all for that. As I've said before, I support that. I think it's important and valid for people to be able to offer their services and their teachings and get paid for that. I am anti-capitalist in a systemic way, but I'm not gonna place the blame for capitalism on individuals who are immersed in it and can't get out of it. So on that side, I'm not worried about it. If you're talking about things like large companies repackaging witchcraft and selling witch kits at mall stores and stuff like that, which I think this question is speaking more to that side of things, my feelings are a little bit more complex, but I'm also not entirely against it. We're not the target audience for that. So a lot of that stuff, it's not new. It's been happening forever. Anytime the occult gets popular, larger platforms and companies are going to come along and they're going to repackage it and sell it. Think about, spirit boards taking off as a household game in the 1920s after the spiritualist movement, things like that. Again, it's nothing new. There was a huge wave of this stuff in the 90s when the craft and practical magic and Buffy were all popular, Charmed. But sincere occult practitioners aren't the target audience for that stuff. That's catering and marketing much more to curious onlookers and dabblers, and I think what that really speaks to is the parlor game side of the field, which is old as dirt. So a lot of that stuff really meets a need for people for paranormal thrill seeking, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I think back to when I was a teenager in middle school, say in the 1990s, and again when all those shows in the craft were really popular. So I went to like this slumber party once where some girl had gotten a, crappy spellbook kit from some big chain store, and it had no substance in it whatsoever. And, but I didn't need to. That wasn't the point of it. We weren't trying to do real witchcraft. Everybody was gathering around going, tee hee hee, I wonder if this is real. So it really was for entertainment purposes only. And better in that context if it doesn't do anything real. If people are approaching the occult as a game, which some subset of people always are going to do, and probably more people than our actual sincere practitioners are going to be doing that, it's better that they encounter game material than get in over their heads with stuff that they're not prepared to deal with and don't really want to deal with. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I think we can do valid critiques and pushbacks when there are like ecology and sustainability and cultural appropriation concerns. Things like if those spell kits that major chains are pushing have over-harvested unsustainable ingredients like white sage or Palo Santo or whatever. Like there are areas where critiquing some of this stuff makes a lot of sense, and some serious ethical concerns around things like plagiarism or misinformation. Like, yeah, I can understand some of the dangers there. But overall, that stuff isn't for us. It's not really about us. And it doesn't necessarily have to be our business. And it can actually be a bit of a buffer that makes our lives a little bit easier because it meets that paranormal thrill-seeking bug. It gets some of those people out of our hair. And for some people, that's also going to be their first entry point to looking for more, and it can make this stuff more approachable, more accessible, less scary, and I think that's actually a good thing. It's better to be underestimated and seem a little bit silly by association than it is to be super feared, and also for some people, they might get a lot out of a gentler and sillier and more fun entry point to this stuff, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, I would just live and let live with most of it. Should there be paywalled communities and online courses? Absolutely, abso-fucking-lutely. I'm all for paywalls. That meets a bunch of needs. So as a creator in this field, anything that you put out there to the entire internet, it's going to get ripped off. It's going to get plagiarized. It's going to get taken out of context. People are going to steal your shit as soon as you make it, and before you're even keeping the lights on in your own practice if your stuff is good. And people are also going to take things out of context. So as a creator, having a paywall community, even if it's like super accessible, and like my Patreon subscription starts at $1 a month because I want people to be able to actually access it. But just having that $1 cap weeds out a lot of like copycats, plagiarists, bootleggers, and trolls automatically. And a lot of people struggle with like online harassment. So just having some layer of protection to clear some of the trolling and to have more block power. Paywalls also reinstall a bit more of a give and take dynamic in a field where creatives are really pressured to undercharge for our work and to give everything that we're doing away for free and to be constantly generating free stuff. There needs to be a give and take balance there, and the paywall supplies that. Paywall communities usually fund and back the free sides of our work. When we do have stuff that we give away for free, it costs time and money out of pocket to build a website or host a blog or a podcast or anything like that. So when people have paywall communities, that's a really important side of being able to do free work as well. And then on top of that, it can be really helpful to speak to a smaller group of people who really want to be there. You can go deeper and get into more intermediate and advanced material, more weird and idiosyncratic material when you're speaking with a smaller audience than you can when you're trying to speak to the entire fucking internet. So I'm a big fan of paywalls, both as a creative and as a seeker and a student. And there are other occultists that I support through their classes and their Patreons, and I really value those spaces. Some of the most interesting conversations that I've witnessed in the occult space over the last few years have been playing out in paywalled communities, Discords, Patreons, and classes, and that's great. So, all for it. we really, I'm through all of these, I'm hearing a lot of people just craving, and this, again, this stuff is not new. Everybody wants more intermediate and advanced and deeper material, and everybody also wants everything to be super cheap and free, and you can't have both. You just can't. The intermediate and advanced stuff takes a lot more time to develop. It takes a lot more labor and testing to develop and to workshop to be able to give to an external audience responsibly. And then there are more consequences with the more intermediate and advanced stuff potentially to being taken out of context. We can't have more of that depth material and then also have it be open and free all the time. There needs to be a balance there where there's give and take and support for the people that are creating that stuff, and then also being offered in appropriate venues where it's still attached to its nuance and its context, and you're getting enough of the bigger picture to engage with that stuff in a way that's effective and safe. How does one ensure the authenticity of courses, workshops, memberships, etc. as a financial investment? So barring actual scams and red flags that we've already talked about, most of this comes down to figuring out what's right for you and what speaks to you and your needs in the moment. So if you're working on something that's a particular problem, you might seek out somebody who has credentials that speak to that, or somebody that has a similar experience and background and identity to you. That can be helpful. But for the most part, just with general occultism stuff, for me, it's the podcast to book to Patreon pipeline, and I found that very helpful and effective in finding the right resources and matches for me. So if I like what somebody has to say in an interview for a couple hours, I'm probably going to like their book. If I like their book, I'm probably going to like their subscriptions and their classes. And that's definitely been the case for me. And then also, if I find a podcaster that I really like their style and their outlook and their approach, I'm probably going to like more of their guests. Blogs, you can also find stuff on blogs. I certainly have. So start with the free stuff in longer form media like blogs and podcasts, where you can really get a sense of what somebody has to say and what their viewpoint and personality is. And then getting a book is going to be a less expensive thing usually than classes or subscriptions. That's going to give you a lot more of a deeper look into their worldview and practices and approaches. And then if the book works for you, go ahead and take their classes if and as you can afford to. What are some topics of conversation I'd like to see more of in our community? I think our community is very talented and skilled at coming up with topics for conversation, and a lot of the conversations that I would like to see happening already are happening, and I'd just like to see more of them. I would love to see more acknowledgement that the pandemic is still happening in this and every other community. And I would love to see more conversations around unpacking ableism and spirituality. I think that's a big one. I would also really love to see more pushback on AI art from people who are not artists in the community, and more understanding of what's going on there, why artists are so pissed about AI art. So the beef there is not with the tech being too democratic or too fast for us to keep up with. The problem is that AI art was stocked and sourced overwhelmingly on stolen copywritten work that was taken without the knowledge or consent of the people that it sourced from. And AI art has the capacity to very closely mimic the styles of the artists that it trained on. And again, those people were not compensated, they were not informed, they did not consent to have their work taken that way. So it's mass exploitation, it's a labor rights issue, it's a devaluing arts issue. It really sucks, it's super shitty. It's being billed as this amazing democratic tool for everybody to be more creative, but actually it's a small number of wealthy tech companies in Silicon Valley stealing from the masses stuff that was already democratized and already openly shared, and profiting off of that, and basically swindling people by billing it as this great democratic thing when it's built on mass theft and mass exploitation. So I don't want to see people harassing people for using this stuff before they realize like how the sausage is made and what the score is there. I'm not asking people to like really jump down people's throats about this or anything, but just education and information there. Understand that it is an issue. I do see a lot of support for the arts and artists supporting other artists in this community, and I appreciate that so much. And I would just like to see more solidarity with working artists on the AI thing. Don't glamorize it. Don't make it cute. It's not cute. And once you realize how toxic that situation is, just stop using it and pressure tech companies and pressure lawmakers to generate AI art tech that actually is ethically sourced and that feeds off of consenting paid artists and public domain material. I would love to have those tools. I would fucking love to actually use AI art if it were ethically sourced, and it's not, so I'm not willing to go there. And I would just like to see more non-artists standing with the yes artists on this one. How can we as a community come together more with constructive criticism without it seeming shady and passive aggressive? Keeping it solicited is huge here. So seek consent and check in with people before offering feedback or criticism. Just say, hey, can I offer you a note here? Or I'm noticing something that I'm a little bit concerned about. Are you open to feedback? And we do have to respect when people say, you know what, no, I'm not up for that right now. So recognizing where it is and isn't our place to comment to begin with is a pretty big part of it. Delivering thorns with roses is also very important. We need to acknowledge things that people are doing well and what people's strengths are, ending on a positive or a note of encouragement, saying what people are capable of and really focusing on their capacities for creation and growth are really important. Constructive criticism shouldn't be about the person giving the criticism, and a lot of times criticism is more about the giver than the receiver, but for criticism to truly be constructive, it needs to be invested in the other person's growth, and it really needs to be focused on and about them and include nurturing and noticing and caring what they're good at and what they're capable of. So if you have a critique to make or a bone to pick where you're not invested in the other person's growth, there can still be a space for that, but I think it belongs on your own platform. And for those discussions, I think it would be better and more constructive overall to focus on broad patterns and issues and take the personal dynamics out of it. So don't include identifying information about other parties involved. Focus on your side of the patterns and the issues. Talk about things more broadly, not include ad hominem attacks, and brainstorm solutions and include offerings of solutions when we want to do broader critiques. Hey guys, my camera cut off there and it's late in my day, so this already ran pretty long and I'm gonna have to edit it down. I think I'm just gonna leave off there, and I've got a few more notes and a whole written portion of this on the blog, which is linked below. You can find more of my work at interrobangtarot.com and evmarin.com, which are linked below. And just appreciation again for this conversation. Some interesting stuff aside from basic human rights things where we really do need a consensus and agreement on who gets to be a person to be able to have a conversation at all. Aside from that, there's a lot of different ways to handle all this stuff, and I really do think that having conversation without consensus and having amiable disagreement is really beneficial and makes us stronger. So that's exciting, and this has been fun. Thanks for watching, and take care. Cheers.